We've mentioned gluconeogenesis and glycolysis and glycogenesis and glycogenolysis. And so the question that I gave you, that I posed, was with the flight that crashed in the Gobi Desert. And we had somebody that was very muscular, somebody that was overweight, somebody that was old, and somebody that was young. And which one had a better chance of survival with limited food and water?
Overweight.
Okay, the overweight person, for a couple of reasons, in his favor or her favor, I forget which one it was fuel source.
Lipid.
So adipose tissue has a more concentrated form of nutrients, so you have a greater number of calories per gram. What was the problem with the Olympic weightlifter winner? All right, so very little fat. Pardon? Acidosis with the breaking down of the proteins and the releasing of amino acids. That could be a problem with the lipid tube, but a little bit more energy involved. And then you have a fluid that you need to get rid of, the nitrogen, the urea, ammonia that would be produced as a side effect of the protein component. Also, somebody in the morning class brought up the aspect that with all that muscle, they would have a higher metabolic rate. And the muscle, even if they're not using it, with all that blood supply and stuff, would be requiring more energy. Okay? Problem with our older pilot, the one that caused the crash in the first place because he couldn't fly at night, but he had poor night vision. So the older you are, the temperature settings, the regulation that occurs with the hypothalamus starts to go haywire. All right? So your ability to reset your metabolic levels, to adjust your body temperature to the amount of heat around you starts to go haywire. And then with the infant, that part is not mature, but in addition, remember the infant is going to lose more fluid from perspiration, more heat from a greater surface to body ratio, volume. So the infant has a greater surface area to volume ratio. So with the age, less mature hypothalamus and then that greater surface area to volume ratio, the infant is less able to adapt. All right, so as we look at the stages right after digestion, we have the absorptive stage, which up here is referring to as the fed state. And we have, so this would be within a couple of hours of eating. And then we would have the post-absorptive, which is any time after those couple of hours. A little bit longer if you were eating a high lipid content. That absorptive state is going to last a little bit longer. And so this slide is on the website. So we're going to have high levels of glucose in the absorptive state, increased levels of glucose. And, bless you. And amino acids are going to be elevated if you had protein in your diet. And if you also had lipids, of course, we're going to have elevated fatty acids. So, as we'll see in a few minutes, when we look at our hormones, the body's response primarily to the elevated glucose is going to be what? Insulin secretion. Okay? So we're going to see increased insulin, actually primarily with the glucose. And that's going to result in a lowered glucose levels and lowered amino acids and fatty acids for that matter anyway. All right, if we have excess amino acids, we typically use those to form proteins, and we store the fatty acids back in our, not back in, but into our adipocytes as fat cells. So then when we get to a post-absorptive state, where these levels have dropped and the body tries to maintain homeostasis, all right, then we start to return these components to the blood. And so the body uses the hormone glucagon primarily at the liver to increase glucose levels. All right, because in our post-absorptive state, all of these would be decreased. Bless you. Now, let's say that we don't have very much glucose. All right, we have been in a low-carb diet, 10 grams of carbohydrates a day, nothing fun to eat. I gave all but one of my dark chocolate truffles for Mother's Day away. I kept one. Yes.
Why?
Kids were so sweet, and I didn't want to be tempted. They were hand-picked, however. Well, I had one and a half. I had a lemon truffle and a tiramisu. I think there's still 2 more at home that the kids haven't eaten, but
Oh my gosh, eat them.
they were Godiva chocolates too. So let's say that I've limited my carbs. All right, so now we go into the body has little carbs. The glucagon's not going to result in the release of carbs from my liver because I haven't put very much glycogen there. So now my body has to resort to fats and proteins for fuel. So what do we call that process where the body then starts to break down stored proteins and fats in our post-absorptive state and uses that for fuel? Anybody remember that all these words started with a G?
Gluconeogenesis.
Gluconeogenesis. Okay, so that's when we use either amino acids or fatty acids for fuel. So this is just going through a series of those. So now let's look at those hormones and turn to, before we do that, there's a correction on page 72. At the top where it says vitamin, and it says niacin is a component of NAD, that's incorrect. It's actually nicotinamide, which I have listed for you correctly back on page 56. Pardon? Cross out niacin, and the correct answer is nicotinamide back on page 56, number 8 of the summary. Either correct that now or write that page down and just go in there. Okay. Okay, so let's look at page 74 now. And I'm going to go out of sequence with the formulas that you have on the page, and we're going to go to insulin first.
Can I ask you a question on gluconeogenesis?
Yes.
You said from amino acids and fatty acids?
From proteins and fats. Gluconeogenesis
Okay.
then
What
uses
about-
the amino acids and fats for energy.
Okay, what about from glycogen? Is that not considered?
Now, glycogen is glycogenolysis, so it takes the glycogen to glucose, and then we just use that glucose down the regular, normal glucose catabolic pathway.
Okay, and I was also under the impression that fatty acids cannot be turned into glucose.
We don't turn them into glucose, we turn them into energy. So, remember,
So glucogenesis is not making glucose for energy?
no, it's using, it sounds like we're making glucose out of new components, but gluconeogenesis,
Is there a term for making glucose out of amino acids? Because that is a thing.
it may be used under the same terminology, but when we talk about gluconeogenesis, let's see if I have a slide for it. When we talk about gluconeogenesis for, well, actually, it's the first slide on this entire pathway. So over here, fats, as fatty glycerol can come into glyceraldehyde and then go through our pathway, and fats can be converted through beta oxidation to the acetyl group and then enter into the citric acid cycle. So on the source of how we get energy, like heart can use fatty acids and so on, is all in this direction. As far as a specific nutrient or chemical term for going back the opposite direction, I don't know if they just use the same term for taking amino acids back to glucose, but for energy-wise, it's one direction. It's not revert is not limited to, but the concept is bringing in other nutrient sources to form ATP. So I don't know if there's a different term for taking specifically amino acids. Saman, you know more about the processing of protein. I'd have to look it up, Chad, and see during lab time and see if there's something more specific for that. Going back to glucose with just amino acids. But gluconeogenesis and this concept is going towards ATP rather than the reverse. Okay? All right. So looking at the hormones that are involved in this, we talked about insulin a lot more than I'm going to in this fashion here. But so insulin's role, if you remember, is to increase the glucose transport proteins. GLUT is for glucose transport. And so as we go through these hormones, again on a very superficial level, I'm going to create a table for you. You will see something similar on the exam, where I will list the hormone, ask for the organ that secretes it, and then ask what does it do, maybe not for every single hormone, every single aspect, what does it do to blood levels of glucose, fatty acids, and amino acids. All right? So here's the hormone. Here's the organ. And the levels of glucose, amino acids, and fatty acids. All right? So insulin, I think all of you know, is made by the pancreas, beta cells of the pancreas. And since it increases the cell's content of glucose transporters, it's going to increase the removal of glucose from the blood. All right? So we're going to see a decrease. This is the absorptive hormone. It's the hormone that's in effect the first couple of hours after a meal. So this is in plasma. Blood levels of these components. So it's going to decrease glucose levels. It's also going to decrease amino acids, and it's going to decrease fatty acids. All right, as all of these are taken up and stored. Now, this is with insulin secretion, obviously is stimulated by an increase in glucose and some amino acids in the blood. It can be stimulated by the autonomic nervous system. So would you expect insulin levels to rise with sympathetic or parasympathetic? Para. Vagus nerve is our nerve of digestion. Okay, remember the phrase rest and digest? So it decreases heart rate, it increases the secretions of the stomach and the small intestine and the motility.